doing this. So breathing retraining is very important, and the ideal when the FreeSpiro device uses um, a way of teaching you to breathe in, breathe out. It's actually you're breathing in to start with, always through your nose. You're breathing in for 1 second and breathing out for 2 seconds. And toward the end of it, you're breathing in for 2 seconds and out for 4 seconds. So you ask people, do you sigh? Do you take shallow breaths? And pay attention to it. So you have to learn these anxiety management tools and understand that they're temporary, that once you really desensitize yourself and quit scaring yourself, then you're going to be okay. And you don't have to pay attention to breathing all the time or constantly tell yourself, well, that's not true. Quit doing that. So you have to understand that the anticipatory anxiety is actually, for many people, worse than the actual panic attacks. And so you try to reframe it and tell yourself, well, it's okay to be anxious for a minute, but it's going to be okay. So my friend John Hoover came up with something he called clearing that and talked about clear thinking, and he uses this model all over the world. And he said that your thoughts can be divided into four categories, and there's some overlap. Facts or truths, beliefs, expectations, and predictions. A fact is what is and what isn't. Um, and this is a watch, this is not a snake. Those are facts. Beliefs are value judgments, opinions. An expectation is how you think things ought to be or ought not to be, people ought to be, situations ought to be. Predictions, what might happen and what might not happen. So if we look at, we kind of ignore this column for the moment, and we focus on these columns, then what we'll see is that beliefs, value judgments, opinions, strawberry is good, chocolate's bad. People from the South, speak slowly, so they must be stupid. Um, all Texans are racist. Very few Texans are racist. And I was born in Texas, so that's why I picked on Texas. The And so, when you have that, you might say, well, I'm the only person that has panic attacks. You would have the expectation, well, I shouldn't have these. People shouldn't have these. And then, unfortunately, the big problem is predictions. I'm going to have a heart attack and go die. I'll go crazy. I won't ever get well. And you say, well, what are the facts here? A fact is that panic attacks are false alarms, no real danger. When it comes to social anxiety, you might think, well, I'm sick, weak, or crazy. That's a belief. I shouldn't get anxious. That's an expectation. People are going to laugh at me. I will lose my train of thought. I'll have a panic attack. People will see how stupid I am. And those are the predictions of somebody who often gets anxious when they speak in public. Now, I gave an example, a silly one. As I said, I was born and raised in Texas, and some Texans admit to racism. Now, that might lead you to these different beliefs or an expectation. If you're a person of color, you shouldn't go to Texas. You go there, they'll hunt you down and kill you. That can happen, but one of the things I like to tease people with anxiety, especially panic and social anxiety, is I say, you really suck at probability. But I give this model to people and I say, really learn this and understand it. You have to look at these biases. And say, well, can you think of an exception of that? Or how many times have you, asked somebody out on a date or asked for directions and they turn around and shot you? Well, never. Well, okay. Then you really are not predicting very accurately, are you? And then at some point along the way, what you're encouraging people to do is to test out the predictions by performing desensitization. So let me give you an example that I often use. So many, many years ago, a young man who was a law student at University of Tennessee came to see me for panic disorder. And if you live in this area, you know that Knoxville's in Knox County and Maryville is in Blount County. And he had panic attacks that happened while he was driving on the interstate, and in Pavlovian conditioning form, his brain associated driving out of town with panic, so he became, bound by geography. He couldn't drive out of Knox or Blount County without feeling very anxious or having a panic attack, so he settled for just staying in there. Well, the problem was he was in law school and wanted to be a horse lawyer, and that would require doing some time up in Kentucky where the horses are. He had a chance at a summer clerkship with some equine attorneys up in Lexington, and he couldn't go. So I said to him, and at the time I treated him with alprazolam, and I said, I can help your panic attacks, but you have this behavioral avoidance called agoraphobia, and the only way you're going to get over it is to practice. And the important thing is, and this is where the interoceptive desensitization is very important. I said, you have to desensitize to the physical feelings of anxiety and panic. So, I say, let's use a weightlifting analogy. I am not a weightlifter and I have skinny little biceps. If I want to lift 2-pound weights, I can do that all day. I'll still have skinny biceps. The only way I'm going to build my muscles is to lift heavier and heavier weights, 10, 20, 30, 40. I don't want to start out bench pressing 600 pounds or I will hurt myself, probably drop it on my neck, and bad things will likely happen. So I said, if you gauge your anxiety on that Likert scale of 1 to 10, or your panic where 1 is feel great, you're home by yourself, medicated, maybe a beer or two, and 10 is catastrophic, your worst panic attack in the world, or in social anxiety, you're having to give a talk to, 1,000 people and you suddenly go mute and your zipper's unzipped or your bra strap showing and you're humiliated on national TV. Well, a 1 doesn't help and a 10 doesn't help. So you got to do kind of a mid-level 4, 5, 6 level anxiety. So I say, I want you to do a 4, 5, or 6 level anxiety provoking situation and do it 3 times a week. So he said, okay. So he comes back in a few weeks and he said, well, guess what? I drove out of the county. I drove to Monroe County down to Madisonville. And I said, well, great. What level of anxiety did you get? He said, only a 2. I said, that didn't count. Why not? I hadn't been out of the county in 2 or 3 years. And I said, because you only got a 2. That was probably the Xanax that did that. You didn't do the desensitization to the feelings of anxiety. So did you do anything that made you anxious, like a 4 or 5? And he said, yeah, I didn't tell you this, but I'm really scared to ride in a car with somebody else. And he was going to take his truck down to what we call the Strip on Cumberland Avenue, about 3 blocks away, to get a hamburger, and his truck got towed. And he immediately began panicking. And his friend said, well, I'll drive. So he said, when I had to ride with my friend 3 blocks and come back, that was an 8. And then that night I had to ride with another friend out to the tow yard and deal with those guys, give me a hard time, and pay $150 to get my truck back, and that was a 9. I said those 2 were a little bit too much, but actually you did more desensitization work with those 2 events than driving to the next county. And he said, oh, I get it. And the good news is over time he got over this and can fly to the Caribbean and drive to other states, so all is well. So, and this is how we talked about it. You have to desensitize to the level of anxiety, not just the situation. We can't, if you have agoraphobia, I can't say we're going to desensitize you to mile marker 700, 701, 702. That's not how it works. Now, so we talked about interoceptive exposure, and I'll show that in a minute. And some therapists use eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or EMDR. Jerry Fried certainly does that, and also in vivo desensitization, getting out there and doing that. So, we already talked about the panic and breathing, and that is important. So when Barlow talked about the interoceptive desensitization, he's talking about the internal sensations of the organism. So panic patients are highly aware of bodily sensations. They're often on guard against it. They have these beliefs and predictions of bad things. And what was interesting is that what Jerry says is teaching progressive muscle relaxation in panic disorder can actually make panic worse because the body doesn't easily respond to commands and increases the pathological hypervigilance. And a large challenge is the tendency of those panic attacks patients to be inactive. Trusting your instincts and paying attention to your body are counterproductive. So with the interoceptive desensitization and exposure, you will tailor the measures to the symptoms. If somebody has chest tightness, for example, which triggers the fear of having a heart attack, you would have the person lie down and put some heavy textbooks on their chest. If they're afraid of having a stroke because they feel dizzy, you might put them in a chair and spin them around. Other kind of things. If breathing is a huge trigger, which is pretty common, you might have them breathe through a straw or a coffee stirrer or have them hold their breath. But you have to watch with that one for precipitating a panic attack. Running upstairs to increase heart rate, breathing fast, hanging upside down, shaking your head back and forth, all of those things. EMDR can be very helpful because panic attacks can be very traumatic, and they may fear getting off medications. It's not a substitute for the other CBT, but it's as part of the EMDR treatment. Establishing a safe place is also quite helpful in people with panic disorder. Now, there are different types of panic, including panic attack variants. There's one called the limited symptom attack, or minor panic attacks, or the most interesting name, non-fear panic attacks. And these have fewer symptoms. They don't usually have the catastrophic, I'm dying or going crazy. So that can happen. The other what's interesting is something called anger attacks. And these can happen in people that have never had panic attacks, and they are out of the blue, way out of proportion to anything that's happened. And it may be kind of the fight response, of the fight flight that happens, and they respond to antidepressants and benzos just as regular panic attacks do. So let's talk about social anxiety disorder. Social anxiety disorder is extreme anxiety over ordinary social events, and it's experienced with extreme fear or avoidance. There's a big fear of being embarrassed, scrutinized, and saying the wrong thing. Now, there's several different rating scales, and I heartily encourage you to use rating scales for social anxiety as well as panic disorder. And one of the big reasons, especially with social anxiety, because people may not tell you. You know, I always tell people I had pretty significant social anxiety from about age 5 to 30, and then started getting some training to do public speaking and began doing it more and more often and getting a lot of enjoyment out of it and desensitizing, and now I have very little in the way of social anxiety symptoms. But I certainly would have been probably in the severe range when I started. So one of them is the Leibowitz, the other one is the SPIN, or Social Phobia Inventory. And there's a little bit different questions, like the Leibowitz talks about eating in front of people and using public restrooms that the SPIN does not. But they're both, you know, quite easy, and You can have somebody take it right in front of you in an interview, and you can use this to track progress as well. So there's a book that I'm referencing and certainly recommend. I think is a good one. It's a new one, Ellen Hendrickson's How to Be Yourself, Quiet Your Inner Critic and Rise Above Social Anxiety. And she quotes Moscovitch in talking about the core fear of this. And what Moscovitch said was that the fear is the big reveal, not the magician's reveal, but the reveal of I'll be revealed, I'll be uncovered. And so the reveal can be divided into 4 types. The fear that of your anxiety that will be visible. You'll be seen blushing, stuttering, trembling. Of your appearance, you're ugly, you're overweight, you're not dressed right. Your personality, you're stupid, dull, imposter. Or your social skills, that you won't make sense. And I'll demonstrate that in the video in a bit. So, social awareness is important, and that it's good for cohesiveness. We're tribal creatures. It's good to learn, when we upset people, when we anger people, when we make people like us, and unfortunately, you can have a situation where you're born with a tendency toward behavioral inhibition. Even you see them in monkeys, and that toddlers with behavioral inhibition, if you survey their parents, you will see 40% of those parents have social anxiety disorder, and even preschoolers who were exposed to new students, new teachers, new games, had that degree of social anxiety disorder in their parents. And the behavioral inhibition, increases your risk of having that. They're happy babies and they're shy babies. So social awareness is important, but too little, where you offend people or hit people or do things that upset people, can lead to abandonment and violence. In the biblical times, banishment was, tantamount to death. You were removed from food and water. Um, if you have too much social awareness, you can be hypervigilant, paranoid, anxious, and be severely. So we know that the amygdala, this is a functional brain imaging, is our threat apparatus. It actually is scanning the environment looking for change. If you look at the floor and everything looks great, and then all of a sudden you are looking at the floor and you see something black slithering toward you, your amygdala goes snake, and jump back. There was an interesting study where they took people with social anxiety and healthy controls, and they gave them a series of tests to see if they could light up the amygdala with facial expressions. And they gave them non-threatening tests, calculations, vocabulary, and then they gave them this test and essentially lied to them. It said, this is a picture matching test. Match the picture on top to the one on bottom. And as soon as they said, well, it's the woman on the left, well, what happened was they would go the next one, next one, next one. But unbeknownst to the people in the study, at random intervals in the picture matching test, they showed pictures of people who looked angry, disgusted, or afraid. And angry and disgusted are the ones that are probably bring out the most anxiety. And people that didn't have social anxiety never lit up their amygdala. People with social anxiety didn't light it up when they showed a neutral face or the simple calculations or vocabulary, but whenever they showed them somebody looked angry or disgusted, they lit up their amygdala.